The photo was found in the archives of an old house in Savannah, folded between pages of a forgotten journal. The paper smelled of dust and age, its corners eaten by time, but the image itself had endured. It showed 7 young women standing in front of what appeared to be the porch of a large plantation home. Their dresses were stiff with fabric that belonged to another century, their hair coiled neatly, and their faces turned toward the camera with an unsettling stillness. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a rare 1847 photograph, remarkable only for its survival. But when the researchers enlarged the image, they stopped speaking. Something in the picture made the room colder, as if the air itself recoiled from what was staring back at them. The city of Savannah had always been haunted by ghosts, both in legend and in reality. The cobblestone streets still whispered of slavery, old money, and families who had built fortunes on the backs of broken lives. It was the kind of place where the past was never truly buried, where every old house carried secrets inside its walls. By the mid-1800s, Savannah was a city balanced between elegance and cruelty. The people who lived in its grandest homes smiled at church on Sundays, but behind their doors were stories of greed, violence, and silence. The photograph belonged to that time, a time when appearances meant everything, and sins could be hidden as long as no one dared speak them aloud. The 7 sisters in the photograph were not wealthy in the way that others in their neighborhood were, but their family carried a strange kind of respect. Their father was a landowner, not the richest man in Savannah, but a man who carried influence because of what he knew about others. He had a way of listening, of keeping track of things people said when they thought no one else could hear. He traded secrets as others traded moan. Why? And it gave him power. His daughters grew up in that shadow, learning that silence could protect, but also destroy. Neighbors remembered the sisters as polite but distant. They walked together through town like a line of soldiers, never one without the other, never lingering long enough to form friendships. People whispered about them because they seemed to move in unison, as if guided by something unspoken. Their laughter, when it came, carried an edge that unsettled anyone nearby, sharp and too controlled. In a city where women were expected to marry young and bring honor to their families, the sisters remained curiously untouched by the hands of suitors. Some claimed their father forbade it. Others said the girls themselves turned men away with a single cold glance that on the surface, nothing seemed out of place. The family attended church, contributed to gatherings, and kept their home in order. But in every story told about them, there was always a pause, an unspoken detail left hanging. The sisters had a way of watching, of making people feel as if they knew more than they should. Children in the neighborhood would cross the street rather than walk past their iron gate. Women spoke of feeling judged by their eyes, as though every hidden shame was visible to them. And men, especially men, avoided speaking their names when night fell. Inside their home, the walls carried a quiet tension. Their mother had died when the youngest was still a child, and her absence lingered like a cold draft in every room. The father ruled the house with a voice that could bend the air itself. He was not violent in the way of fists or belts, but his control was absolute. The sisters lived by his rules, their days structured, their voices measured. He had raised them not to be wives, but to be something else, though no one outside the house could ever say what IT was in that setting that the photograph was taken. The year was 1847, and photography was still a marvel, a way to capture a moment, as if time could be trapped in glass. The sisters stood on the porch in a row, their posture perfect, their faces free of any trace of childhood softness. Each of them looked directly into the lens, not smiling, not blinking, as though they knew the weight of what would remain after the shutter clicked. Behind them, the house loomed, its windows dark like empty eyes at a first glance. The picture was nothing unusual. But as the researchers leaned closer, the details began to unravel. One sister's hand seemed to press too tightly against another's wrist, leaving the skin pale where the blood had been forced away. Another's eyes appeared darker than they should, not with shadow, but with something that looked almost alive, as if the photograph had caught movement where there should be stillness. And in the far right corner of the frame, half hidden by the porch rail, was a faint shape that did not belong to any of the seven. The discovery of the photograph came long after the family itself had vanished from Savannah's memory. Their name had been erased from the polite records of society, spoken only in hushed fragments by those who claimed to remember. Some said the sisters died in the yellow fever epidemic that swept through the Soho. Others whispered they had been sent away, locked in an asylum for reasons no one dared explain. But the truth was never written, and perhaps it was never meant to be. Before the photograph, their story was only a shadow. After it, the shadow began to take shape. And with it came the realization that behind the perfect image of those seven faces was a history no one had dared to touch. The researchers had not expected to feel fear inside an archive. Yet that night, when the last light was turned off and the room fell into silence, they could not shake the sense that the sisters were still staring back, waiting for something, demanding to be remembered. The photograph was only the beginning, a frozen echo of something that had already been festering long before the shutter captured those seven sisters in their line perfection. As the years in Savannah turned and the war drums in the distance grew louder, so too did the whispers surrounding the family. It began with small things, strange sound from the house late at night, lights in windows long after most of the city had gone quiet, the occasional sharp scream that rose into the humid air and then stopped as suddenly as it came. Neighbors grew accustomed to dismissing what they heard. Savannah was, after all, a city full of ghosts. But with this family, the unease never softened. It sharpened. The sisters grew into women, and yet they did not leave. They did not marry, did not start lives of their own, did not follow the paths expected of them. In a city where reputation was survival, their father's refusal to allow suitors inside the gate sparked endless speculation. Some claimed it was pride. He believed no man was worthy of his daughters. Others whispered it was punishment, that he held them close because they carried a shame he wanted hidden. The truth, though, was far more complicated. Inside the home, the father's grip only tightened. Each daughter lived under his watch, their lives structured around his rules. The oldest, Clara, had once dared to dream of escape, sneaking letters to a young man she met at church. But the father found them, and the man disappeared within weeks, sent away on business and never returning. Clara never spoke his name again. That silence, heavy and complete, taught the others what defiance cost. They began to turn inward, their world reduced to one another, each sister watching the others with eyes that carried both love and suspicion. It was around this time that jealousy first began to rot between them. Eliza, the second eldest, was the favored one. At least, that is what the others believed. Their father often called her into his study alone, and when she emerged, her face was pale but calm, her lips pressed tight as though she had swallowed words she would never let out. The younger sisters noticed the way his hand sometimes rested on her shoulder a moment too long, or the way he defended her when others were corrected. What he gave her was not love, but control disguised as it. And it planted in the minds of the others the sense that Eliza had something they could not reach, something they might both envy and fear. The youngest, Margaret, carried a different burden. Barely more than a child when her mother died, she grew up with no memory of softness, no sense of a world outside the walls. She clung to her sisters for comfort, but as she grew older, she began to see them not as protectors, but as rivals. Their laughter felt pointed, their whispers sharpened like knives. She had dreams, dark and vivid, of hands around her throat, of voices chanting her name until she could not breathe. She told no one, but the fears seeped into her waking life, making her restless, quick to lash out, desperate to prove herself. Externa. Pressures pressed against the family like a tide. The economy in Savannah began to shift, fortunes rising and falling with every passing season. Their father, who had once held quiet power through secrets and debts, found himself increasingly cornered. Those he had blackmailed began to outlive him, their sons inheriting both wealth and arrogance, unwilling to bow to his whispered threats. His land did not stretch as far as it once had, his influence thinning. He demanded more of his daughters, molding them into tools of preservation rather than children. They were expected to keep appearances flawless, to sit in church pews with heads high, even as their home grew colder and darker. The sisters turned on one another in small ways at first. A dress ruined by spilled ink, a letter hidden before it could be sent, a cruel comment whispered just loud enough to be heard. Yet these were not the games of ordinary siblings. They carried venom. They understood that to weaken one was to draw closer to the father's eye, to the possibility of being chosen, favored, protected. But none of them ever truly won, because the man who stood at the center of their world thrived on their division. He wanted them obedient, yes, but also desperate. Desperation made them malleable. There were nights when Savannah heard their laughter, 7 voices rising in unison, high-pitched and unending. It carried across the street, through the iron gate, into the homes of neighbors who pressed pillows over their ears. Some swore it went on for hours, others said for days. When questioned, the sisters would smile and say nothing, their silence more chilling than denial. People stopped asking. Each sister bore her own secret grief. Clara mourned the love she lost, though she never spoke his name. Eliza held her father's favoritism like a curse, unable to refuse him but unable to escape. Margaret wrestled with her nightmares until she began to confuse them with reality. The middle sisters, Anne, Ruth, Lydia, and Sarah, carried their own bitterness, each convinced they had been wronged, each looking for some way to be seen. Together, they looked like a perfect row of daughters. Inside, they were a web of tension so tight it could snap with the smallest touch. The breaking point came not from within, but from outside. By the early 1850s, whispers spread of a scandal involving the family. A missing girl, a servant whose name was not written in the papers, vanished one summer night. Some claimed she had run away. Others whispered she had been seen last on the family's property. The father denied it with such force that no one dared press further. But the rumors lingered, and in Savannah, rumors had a way of becoming truth no matter how often they were denied. The sisters felt the shift immediately. They became pariahs in social circles, their invitations dwindling, their presence met with polite but distant smiles. Where once they had been feared, now they were pitted or shunned. The father's temper grew sharper. He called them ungrateful, accused them of bringing shame to his name. His punishments became harsher, not with hands but with words, with long silences. He carved into their hearts more than shouting ever could. What no one outside the house knew was how far the cracks had spread. The sisters began to speak less to the outside world and more to each other, their conversations twisting into arguments, their arguments collapsing into eerie silence. At times, they seemed to move as one again, but now it was not unity born of choice, it was survival. They knew their father was faltering, his grip loosening with age and debt, and they began to sense that when he fell, they would either rise together or be destroyed one by one, be by the time the photograph was taken. The sisters were already bound by something more than blood. They were bound by shared fear, by jealousy sharpened into knives, by the secrets of their house that no one dared speak aloud. And when the researchers in the modern day stared at that photograph, what froze them was not just the sight of 7 women staring back. It was the knowledge that every face in that picture carried the weight of a breaking point, a storm that had already begun, one that would not end without blood. The night it happened, Savannah was drowning in heat. The air clung to the skin like wet cloth, the kind of heat that made people restless, unable to sleep. The cicadas shrieked from the trees, and from the river came the low groan of a steamboat horn. Inside the sisters' house, all the windows were closed, the curtains drawn, though the air was stifling. A single oil lamp burned in the parlor, throwing shadows across the peeling wallpaper. The father had summoned them all there, his voice sharp as a blade, his patience already worn to threads. He had discovered something, no one knew how. Maybe it was a letter, maybe it was only suspicion, but his fury made it clear that one of them had betrayed him. He accused Clara first, his words like venom, spitting that she had tried to shame him again with her secret letters. Clara denied it, her hands trembling at her sides. He turned on Margaret, accusing her of childish lies, of speaking to people she had no right to speak to. One by one, his words cut into each of them until their faces burned red and pale in the lamplight. He spoke of disgrace, of ruin, of how they would all be dragged down if they did not obey him. The sisters stood together, 7 figures in a row, but it was not unity, it was desperation. Their eyes darted between one another, as though searching for the spark that might set the night ablaze. And then he said Eliza's name. He said it in a way that made even the walls lean in, his voice low, almost soft. He accused her of betrayal in a way that carried more weight than the others, as though he knew what he had done to her, as though he wanted to remind her of the power he still held. Eliza did not answer at first. She only stared at him, her lips trembling, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails cut her skin. Something broke in her then. Perhaps it had been breaking for years, each visit to his study a fracture, each long silence a wound. She stepped forward, her face pale, but her eyes burning. She said no, just one word, but it split the air like thunder. No, she would not endure it anymore. The sisters froze, every breath caught in their throats. The father's face twisted, his voice rising, and he reached for her arm, as he had done 1,000 times before. But this time, she pulled back, and in the chaos of the moment, a candlestick toppled from the table. It struck the floor with a clang that echoed through the parlor. And for one Brea. Silence filled the room. Then Margaret, trembling and frantic, picked it up. Her hands shook as though the weight of it was too much for her small frame. The father turned on her, shouting, his voice booming through the walls. He raised his hand, not to strike, but to silence. And in that split second, Margaret swung. The sound was not like in stories. It was sickening, a heavy crack of metal against bone. His body staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief, and the room seemed to tilt as he collapsed to the floor. The lamp flickered, the shadows stretching across his fallen form. Blood spread slowly across the wood, dark and glistening, carrying with it the smell of iron. And no one moved at first. The sisters stood frozen, the reality sinking into their bones. The father, who had held them in his grip for so long, lay gasping, choking on his own breath. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for mercy, but none of them stepped forward. Eliza knelt beside him, not in pity, but in fury. Her voice was low, trembling with rage, as she whispered that he would never touch them again. His eyes widened, as if realizing in that final moment that his power had ended. And then the light drained from them, leaving only the empty stare of a man who had once believed himself untouchable. The room erupted into chaos. Margaret dropped the candlestick as though it had burned her. Clara clutched her mouth, retching, her body shaking with sobs. Lydia ran to the window, pulling the curtains tighter, as though afraid the world outside had seen. Ruth pressed her hands over her ears, rocking as if the sound of the strike still echoed inside her skull. Sarah whispered prayers, broken and uneven, her words tangled with tears. Only Eliza remained still, her hands stained with his blood where she had touched his chest, her eyes locked on the lifeless body as though daring it to rise again. Panic took hold of them. What had been done could not be undone, and each sister's mind raced in a different direction. Clara begged to call for help, but Eliza silenced her with a single look. If anyone knew, they would all be destroyed. They were women in a city that did not forgive women for survival, and no one would listen to what had been done to them. The law would call it murder, not freedom. Their lives would end in disgrace, their names spoken only in contempt. Margaret crumpled to the floor, sobbing, her hands shaking as she stared at the blood that clung to her skin. She said she hadn't meant it, that she hadn't even thought, that it was only fear, only a desperate act to stop the shouting. The others tried to quiet her, but her cries seemed to rattle the very walls. It was Eliza who steadied them, her voice sharp, her presence unyielding. She said they had no choice now. They would have to finish what had begun. The sisters gathered around the body, their breath shallow, their hands trembling as they debated what to do. The air was thick with the stench of blood and sweat, the heat pressing down on them until their skin felt fevered. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps approaching, every gust of wind against the shutters like a knock at the door. Time moved strangely, stretching and collapsing, each minute an eternity. In the end, they worked together, though not out of unity, but necessity. They dragged the body to the back of the house, their fingers slipping on blood, their muscles straining against dead weight. The sound of it scraping across the floor was unbearable, like bones snapping, like teeth grinding. They whispered to one another in frantic bursts, silencing each other when the words grew too loud. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell tolled, marking the hour, as though reminding them that the world outside still moved while. Theirs had come undone. When the body was finally hidden, covered in cloth and left in the shadows, the sisters collapsed in exhaustion. None of them spoke. The house was silent except for their ragged breaths, their hearts still pounding like drums. They sat together in the dim light, not touching, not looking at one another, each trapped in the prison of her own thoughts. The crime had bound them tighter than blood ever could, and yet it had also carved a gulf between them that would never close. The parlor smelled of iron and sweat, of fear and finality. Somewhere in the night, the cicadas sang louder, as though mocking their silence. The father was gone, but his shadow lingered, heavier now than when he lived. And as the sisters sat in the stillness, each of them understood what they had done, not just to him, but to themselves. There would be no going back. The days that followed blurred together, as if time itself no longer moved the way it once had. The sisters lived inside a fog of fear, the air in the house heavy with the scent of blood that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Every floorboard groaned like a whisper. Every flicker of the lamp seemed to cast the shape of their father's shadow across the wall. They could not speak of what had happened in open words, only in glances, half-formed sentences, or silence. Yet the truth clung to them, stitched into their skin. Margaret, who had swung the candlestick, crumbled first. She could not stop shaking, her hands trembling even when she tried to hold a spoon. At night, she woke screaming, certain she saw her father's face at the foot of her bed, his eyes wide with the same shock as in his final moments. She begged her sisters to believe her, swore she heard him pacing the hallway outside her room. The others tried to calm her, but her terror infected them all. Soon, none of them slept deeply. The house echoed, with restless footsteps, with the sharp gasps of dreams too vivid to remain behind closed eyes. Clara was consumed by guilt. She blamed herself for allowing things to reach that point, for not protecting Margaret, for not finding some other way. She spent hours by the window, staring into the street as though waiting for someone to come and accuse them. Every time a neighbor passed, she stiffened. Every time a knock sounded at the door, her body froze with dread. She wrote confessions in secret, scraps of letters she never sent, pouring out her shame onto paper only to burn it later in the fireplace. Watching the words curl into ash, Eliza, who had been the one to defy him, seemed outwardly calm, but her stillness was brittle. She carried herself with the air of someone determined to hold the others together, forcing them into silence, reminding them that they had no choice but to keep the secret. She told them over and over that no one would understand, that the world would call it murder when it had been survival. Yet when she was alone, her composure cracked. She would stand in front of the mirror, staring into her own eyes as though she did not recognize the woman staring back. At night, she pressed her hands against the bloodstain she imagined still lingered on the floorboards. Unable to forget the weight of his final breath, the middle sisters, and Ruth, Lydia, and Sarah, were caught between loyalty and fear, and tried to keep the house in order, scrubbing the floors, polishing the furniture, as though cleanliness could erase what had happened. Ruth fell into prayer, whispering desperate psalms at all hours, her words blurring into frantic murmurs that unsettled the others. Lydia grew sharper, her tongue laced with bitterness, snapping at anyone who faltered, insisting they had done what was necessary. Sarah withdrew into silence, her eyes distant, her presence more like a ghost than a sister. Each coped in her own way, but together they felt fractured, a family bound by blood and crime, each step taking them further from who they had once been. Outside the house, Savannah began to notice. The sister's absence from church raised questions. The father, once such a commanding presence, was no longer seen in the streets. At first, excuses were made: illness, travel, business elsewhere. But as weeks stretched into months, whispers began. Some said he had fallen ill and was hidden from sight out of pride. Others whispered darker things, that the family was cursed, that sins had taken root inside their house and would not let go. The neighbors grew uneasy. The sisters' faces, once regarded with polite distance, now stirred suspicion. People remembered the screams they thought they had heard, the strange laughter that sometimes carried into the night. Stories spread quickly in a city where gossip was as constant as the tide. By the time autumn arrived, the family's reputation had withered into something darker. No one called on them. No one offered invitations. Their name, once spoken with respect or fear, became a caution, a whisper of warning. Inside, the weight of secrecy consumed them. They lived in constant fear of discovery, of a body unearthed, of a servant speaking too freely. The house staff, already uneasy, began to leave one by one, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere. By winter, the sisters were alone, forced to maintain the household themselves. The once proud home decayed around them, dust gathering, paint peeling, the air thick with rot. It mirrored their own unraveling. The psychological toll deepened with each passing season. Margaret's mind frayed beyond repair. She spoke of their father's voice calling her name, sometimes laughing, weeping. She swore she saw him standing in the corner of the room, waiting. The others grew impatient with her outbursts, yet none of them truly disbelieved her. They too felt his presence. A door closing without cause, a draft through a sealed window, the faint creak of footsteps when all were accounted for. These became their daily reality. Whether ghost or guilt, it haunted them. Clara withdrew further, her body wasting as she refused meals, her eyes sunken with sleeplessness. She became the embodiment of regret, her once gentle voice now cracked and hollow. Eliza hardened, carrying the burden of leadership with a cruelty that frightened the others. She silenced Margaret's cries with slaps, forced Clara to eat, and threatened Ruth when her prayers grew too loud. She convinced herself that control was the only way to survive, but in doing so, she became the reflection of the man they had destroyed. The community's suspicion eventually turned into avoidance. Children dared one another to run past the house, whispering about the cursed sisters who lived within. Adults crossed the street to avoid walking by the gate. The city, once bound to them by respect or fear, now treated them as outcasts, dangerous and untouchable. Their father's influence had shielded them once. Without him, they were nothing but a warning. Yet no law ever came to their door. Nobody was discovered, no proof unearthed. What they had done remained hidden, a secret stitched into the very walls of their home. But freedom was an illusion. They lived as prisoners of their own crime, bound to the house, bound to one another, bound to the night they could never erase. The sisters had wanted release from his control, but what they found instead was a deeper chain. They were no longer his victims, nor were they innocent. They had become something in between, something the city of Savannah could sense even if it could not name. And as years passed, their house became a place no one entered, no one disturbed, until finally their story slipped into silence, leaving only a photograph as evidence of what had once been. But silence is not peace. For those 7 sisters, the crime did not end the night it was committed. It lingered in every breath, every glance, every heartbeat, until it consumed them whole. The trial that followed was unlike anything Savannah had seen in decades. The courtroom, filled with whispers and restless eyes, became a stage where grief and guilt clashed openly. Evelyn sat stiff, her once elegant posture now sagging beneath the weight of chains she could no longer hide behind. Across the room, the families of the victims gathered in quiet rows, faces etched with a pain that no sentence could soften. The jury, pulled from the same community that had once admired her family's name, listened not to tales of legacy or power, but to accounts of manipulation, jealousy, and cruelty. Piece by piece, the fragile facade of privilege was stripped away until only raw truth remained. When the verdict was read, there was no cheer, no sigh of relief. Only silence. Evelyn was found guilty of murder, her years of influence unable to shield her from the consequences of her choices. Justice, in a legal sense, had been served, but for those who had lost someone, the word felt hollow. A guilty verdict could not return the laughter of the sisters or erase the nightmares of those who had seen the truth too late. It could not heal the children left behind or restore the reputations of families who had been stained by association. What it did, however, was put an end to the questions of what next. The path forward was brutal but certain. Evelyn would spend the rest of her life behind bars, and the story of her family's cursed name would live on, though not in the way she had once hoped. For the city itself, the crime left scars deeper than any headline could capture. The discovery of the 1847 photograph, with its frozen faces and haunting details, had first seemed like a curiosity, an artifact of history. But it became something far darker, a mirror reflecting how easily the present can echo the sins of the past. The townspeople could not look at the image anymore without remembering what followed. The whispers of obsession, the violent night, and the tragic end of lives that should have been lived in peace. Shops that once hung copies of the photo in their windows quietly took them down. Museums avoided speaking of it. Parents told their children not to go near the old properties connected to Evelyn's family, as though stepping onto the land itself might awaken something best left buried. The backlash against the once powerful family was swift and brutal. Neighbors who had once attended their gatherings now crossed the street to avoid them. Old friends stayed silent, unwilling to be tied to what had unfolded. Generations of carefully built reputation collapse. In months, leaving nothing but whispers of greed and obsession. Even relatives who had nothing to do with the crime found themselves shunned, their lives marked by a legacy they never asked to carry. It became clear that the consequences of Evelyn's actions stretched far beyond her own life. They consumed anyone connected to her bloodline, dragging them into the shadow of her downfall. But the most haunting part was not the trial or the punishment. It was the way the crime forced people to confront truths about themselves. How many had overlooked the signs because they didn't want to believe someone so respected could fall so low? How many ignored the unease they felt around her sharp smile, convincing themselves it was nothing more than their imagination? And how many, deep down, envied the wealth and power that had allowed her to control others for so long? The story exposed not only her cruelty, but also the quiet complicity of a society that allows power to excuse behavior until it's too late. In the years that followed, professors and writers began to use the case as a study of power dynamics gone unchecked. Some argued it was a story of jealousy and obsession, others of generational curses and the weight of history. Yet underneath those theories was a simpler truth. Human behavior is fragile, and when twisted by control, greed, and fear, it can become something unrecognizable. Evelyn's story was not just hers. It belonged to anyone who had ever seen how control can disguise itself as love, how envy can hide behind admiration, and how easily morality bends when power is at stake. As time passed, the crime faded from the front pages, but lingered in memory. The house connected to Evelyn's family remained locked, its shutters closed, as though the building itself was ashamed to look out at the world. The photograph of the 7 sisters was stored in archives, rarely shown, though copies still existed in private hands. Every so often, someone would claim the faces in the image changed when you stared too long, that the smiles twisted into something cruel, or that the eyes seemed to follow you. People laughed it off as superstition, but deep down, many avoided looking at the photo altogether. It had stopped being a relic of history and had become instead a symbol of how beauty and horror often sit side by side, waiting for the right moment to collide. For those closest to the case, life never returned to what it once was. Families carried grief like an open wound. Survivors carried guilt for not seeing the danger sooner, and the city carried the burden of a story it could never fully bury. Yet in that grief was also a strange kind of clarity. People began speaking more openly about power, about control in relationships, about the dangers of ignoring warning signs. The story forced the city to reckon with its past and with its present, sparking difficult conversations about what justice really means and whether it can ever heal the wounds left behind. In the end, the question of whether justice was served remains complicated. Legally, yes, Evelyn would never walk free again. But justice in its truest form, restoration, healing, peace, was harder to claim. Some found it in the silence that followed the trial. Others found it in the knowledge that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. And some never found it all, trapped forever in the moment the crime stole their sense of safety. What the story leaves behind is not just a crime to be remembered by you. A reminder of the darker corners of human nature. It is about the way jealousy can rot love from within, the way control can masquerade as care, and the way society can fail to protect the vulnerable until it is too late. It is about the fragile line between admiration and obsession, between legacy and curse, between justice and vengeance. As the years stretched on, Savannah learned to live with the shadow of the story. People still whispered when they walked past the courthouse, still lowered their voices when a photograph was mentioned. The crime had become part of the city's fabric, stitched into its history alongside stories of war, wealth, and tragedy. And perhaps that is where it will remain. A reminder not just of one woman's choices, but of the truths we all prefer not to face until we are forced to.